Information has exploded furiously around us, and it is all accessible with a click of a mouse. So, what does this mean for our former citadel of knowledge, the library? Joining us now from Boston, Massachusetts, we welcome Robert Darnton. He is head librarian at Harvard University, and it's great to have you on the program, Mr. Darnton. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. To understand the future of libraries in the digital age, let's try and figure out how we got here in the first place. Can you talk to us about the 4 epochs of communication throughout time?
Well, I divide them into 4 epochs. All divisions are arbitrary, and this sounds rather grand. It certainly is technologically driven. So you could say that the history of communication begins with language, but we know that writing was invented somewhere around 4000 BC. We know that the alphabet, which transformed writing, was invented probably somewhere near 1000 BC. And then around the time of the birth of Christ, there was a new invention, the codex. That is to say, a book that you read by turning the pages instead of by unrolling a scroll. Now, that may not sound spectacular, but if you've ever tried to roll a scroll, as people do when they read the Torah, it's not easy. So if you have a book with pages, you can flip around in it, you can orient yourself. The page becomes a unit of perception. That was a huge transformation, the codex. It was very much linked with the spread of Christianity. And then you went through a long period of manuscript communication of the codex until the 1450s, when Gutenberg invented or reinvented printing with movable type. That was a big revolution, of course. But then afterwards, for a long time, there was a kind of technological stasis, so that it wasn't until, believe it or not, I would say 1974, when the internet began to be active. There was the ARPANET before it, but you've got a fundamental transformation in technology with the development of the internet. That was only 1974. And then 1991, you get the web, and after that, a whole series of things, such as search engines, you got relevance rating, you got smartphones, social media, a series of technological changes that have speeded up the pace of a certain kind of communication. So what I'm trying to argue is that in the very long run, you get relatively important changes, but they create a kind of plateau in the world of communication. And today we're living through something that I think is every bit as revolutionary as Gutenberg's time, but it's happening to the entire population. And I think it's a thrilling time to be alive.
Well, that actually was what I was going to follow up on, because anybody who's 20 years old would say it's impossible that anything as revolutionary as what we're experiencing right now ever happened before. But of course, those of us of a certain age have always been told it was Gutenberg and the printing press that was the most revolutionary thing. You want to break the tie on that one?
Well, I'll tell you, one interesting thing that historians of the book, I'm one of these people who've contributed to the creation of a new field, book history. One of the things we've discovered is that after the 1450s, when Gutenberg invented printing with movable type, the manuscript industry actually increased, and it continued to expand for 3 centuries. So you got people publishing books by hiring scribes to copy them out well into the 17th and even the 18th century. So the point is that, oh, yes, it was revolutionary, but it did not knock out the competition, the manuscript book. On the contrary, it reinforced it. So I think we need to investigate how these technological changes spawn effects. And one principle, I think, that we can extract from the history of communication is that one medium of communication does not displace another one. So, as I said, manuscript publishing continued for 3 good centuries after Gutenberg, and in our own era, we know that the radio did not kill newspapers, and TV did not eliminate the radio, and the internet did not kill TV, etc. We're in a period where the whole ecology of communication gets richer and richer. And I honestly think it's quite wrong to imagine, on the one hand, the analog, the digital, the analog, the printed book, opposed to the digital or e-book. I mean, they don't occupy opposite and antagonistic extremes of some kind of, well, spectrum of communication. In fact, they are complementary. So in my view, the exciting development of digital communication is actually a stimulus to communication by print. And we've seen last year the production of printed books in the United States went up by 6%. So publishing is thriving in an, so to speak, traditional way, while the digital public publishing industry is expanding. That's what I mean when I say it's interesting. And furthermore, new kinds of books or forms of communication that are developing that don't fit into either category.
Well, let me amplify on that by quoting you back to you. This is what you said in the New York Review of Books a few years ago about the pace of change, which you said it seems breathtaking. From writing to the codex, 4,300 years. From the codex to movable type, 1,150 years. From movable type to the internet, 524 years. From the internet to search engines, 19 years. From search engines to Google's algorithmic relevance ranking, 7 years. And who knows what's just around the corner or coming out of the pipeline. The pace of change, I appreciate the last point you were trying to make, that these things are not necessarily in competition with each other, but it feels like the next thing coming around the corner, instead of decades or centuries away, days, months, years, it seems pretty quick now.
It does. It's tomorrow. We don't know what it is or what they are, but they are hitting us fast. So if you try to look at the landscape of information, it's sort of like trying to look through a windshield of a car when pellets are raining down at you. The windshield wipers are going strongly, everything's blurred. We can't get a clear view of the future, but one thing we do know is that we are being bombarded with new kinds of communication, new sorts of information, and the pace has indeed increased spectacularly. In that sense, I think we are living in a world, I wouldn't say it's unprecedented, but it is indeed a world where we're becoming accustomed to rapid increases in modes of communication.
One of the changes that we're seeing right now, though, is that what we used to think of as good old shoe leather reporting seems to have been replaced in the dominant format by opinion-driven blogs. It's not about independent investigative research anymore. It's now about, here's what I think, whether there are any facts based on it or not. Does that, to you, represent a dangerous shift in information gathering?
Well, you know, I used to be one of those shoe leather reporters myself, and I spent a lot of time pounding my shoes on the pavement, chasing firemen and policemen, doing the police beat, etc. And I must say, personally, I have a lot of sympathy for the old-fashioned type of reporter, the kind who did get to the source of news, who discovered things, the investigative reporter. I think that those people were a vital source of democracy. What we've seen is that newspapers are suffering. They're suffering in particular because they depend on want ads. I mean, that was the great stream of income for most newspapers. Well, the want ads have migrated onto the internet, and so many newspapers are folding, newspaper reporters are disappearing. It's a hard time for the old traditional press. And I agree that blogging is great. It's wonderful to have people debating all kinds of issues, but that's not the same thing as reporting. And I fear that investigative reporting is suffering. Now, there are attempts to keep it alive. There are foundations who have supported particular fellowships in which veteran reporters are, in effect, subsidized to spend months digging up really important stories, but that's not a permanent solution. So what's going to happen with investigative reporting and the old kind of journalism that made our democracies flourish? I honestly don't know, and it does give me worry. So I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna saying that everything is in the best of all possible worlds of communication. We've got enormous possibilities, but they come at a cost, and everything has to readjust so that some of the functions that existed in the old communication system will continue to be supplied somehow or other. But just one word of warning. People say to me all the time, we live in the information age, as if other ages didn't have information. And the more you study the history of books, the history of communication, the more you realize that information was everywhere. People accessed it in different manners, but it's quite misleading to think that somehow, we exist in an age of information that is totally unprecedented.
Well, you do say information has always been unstable, and with that in mind, let's move to the issue of the library today. What role do you see the library playing in a digital age where, unlike in the days when you or I went to university, and if we wanted to find something out, we actually had to go to the library, that was your only option, today, students don't have to leave their bedrooms or wherever it is they are. So what do you see here?
Well, people often say to me, and this is another case of, I would call it false consciousness, they say, libraries are extinct. The book itself is obsolete. Everything's available online. All information is at your fingertips. That really is quite wrong. First of all, we see more people in libraries now than we ever have seen. We see them at Harvard, where if you go into we have 73 libraries in the Harvard system. You go into any one of them, they're crammed with students, scholars, researchers. Or if you go into a public library, I'm a trustee of the New York Public Library, which has 87 branches. Those branches are full of people seeking information. Some of them actually are seeking information because they're looking for jobs. They can't go to the want ads, as I just explained earlier, so they need to go on the internet, but many of them don't have computers at home, don't know how to use the internet. They go to their branch libraries, and their trained librarians help them use the internet, teach them how to find their way through this confusing world of information and to get what they want. So I would argue that libraries are more vital than they ever were. And in fact, they never were simply warehouses of books. They were nerve centers for communicating knowledge. Now, that kind of communication, in my view, is much more complex and much more important. So the role of the librarian is to be an expert in helping users find their way through cyberspace. I mean, cyberspace is a very complicated area, and people need help. It's easy to Google anything and get the beginning of an answer, but only the beginning, and often a quite misleading start on an investigative project. So we're finding that librarians are really flourishing, and libraries are doing very well, thank you.
Libraries are doing very well, but I wonder, I'm going to push back on you a little bit on this one, I wonder if they're doing well because in our country we would say there's Tim Hortons there, in your country you might say they've got Starbucks or something else there. It's the place where people come to meet now. It's less about retrieving information and help navigating the finding of information, and it's turned into the old Roman Forum now. Is that fair to say?
Well, I would say it's relatively fair to say. I'm all for sociability and intellectual communication, so that if libraries function as an agora where people come and debate things or just exchange information, I think that's great. You often see children in libraries in very large numbers in a way that you didn't before. But I really feel there's a lot more to libraries than that. This is where people learn how to make their way through the new information systems, where they go to librarians for help. And furthermore, it depends on the kind of library you're talking about. But if you talk about research libraries, any research library will have special collections that are not yet digitized, that require special care. They need curators. They have to be developed. And that's where the real riches are for a lot of research. So the idea that all information is online is just absurd. And I'm now talking about printed information, rare books and so on, as well as bestsellers. What about archival information? At Harvard, we have something like 400 million manuscripts, and most of them have never been seen, and they haven't even, many of them, been properly cataloged. If you consider the Archives de France, where I've spent a lot of my life, you should imagine a whole world of paper, manuscripts, waiting to be discovered. Now, you might say, okay, that's of interest for academics, but I actually think that the past, genealogy, local history, the cultural life of a region or a nation is of interest to all citizens. So we're very far away from the time when you just push a button, click a switch, tune in your mouse, and you have everything you need. We're at a period when we're democratizing access to information. I think that's crucial, but we're certainly not there yet.
Well, in that interest of democratizing information, we've been talking bricks and mortars until now, but a few months ago, you helped launch the Digital Public Library of America. Tell us about that.
Well, the Digital Public Library of America actually began as an idea. On October 1st, 2010, a group of about 40 leaders of foundations, of libraries, some computer engineers met at Harvard to discuss the possibility of making available the cultural heritage of the United States to all citizens in the United States, and to do it for free. It sounds extravagant. It actually was extravagant, but very exciting. And after debating the possibility, we decided almost right away, we can do it. We'll create a coalition of foundations to provide the funding, a coalition of libraries to provide the books. We will design an infrastructure. We will create an organization. We will enlist people from all over with all kinds of diverse interests, and we will actually create a library of a kind that never existed. Well, that was October 2010. On April 18th, 2013, the Digital Public Library of America, or DPLA, actually opened. It's now available online. Of course, it's only a beginning of something that I think will grow and grow and grow. And the idea is to create something like the modern Library of Alexandria. Now, it sounds extravagant, it sounds utopian, but you know, there's a lot to be said for utopianism. It doesn't mean that you're unrealistic. It needs to be combined with a second ingredient, which I see as running through U.S. history, and I think also through Canadian history, namely pragmatism. So we had at the beginning of the American Republic utopian thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, who imagined a new kind of republic, but they were also people who could actually get the job done. I mean, I think of Benjamin Franklin, someone who was a typesetter and pressman himself. He came from the working class. He knew what work was and how to make things happen. So if we can bring together the kind of utopian vision of a world in which information is available to everyone, to democratize access to information, combine that with a practical skill in designing the technology, in organizing the modes of operation, I think we can actually produce something that was only a dream at the time of the founding of the American Republic, and that can be a reality, if not quite today, certainly tomorrow. I think we're well on the way to actually accomplishing this.
Okay, I want to not get futuristic at all with you right now, but rather get good old-fashioned with you right now. And that is to ask you about the good old-fashioned book. What, in your view, is so appealing about the physical book that apparently fewer of us are getting our information from these days because more and more of us are buying these e-readers and so on. But what is it about holding a physical product in your hand and reading off it that you find so appealing?
Well, let me count the ways. You know, I'm a book lover. I prefer the printed book, although I'm an enthusiast about the digital book. You hold it in your hands, you can thumb through it, you get the feel of this entity which you are going to read your way through, and the touch of the paper, the grain of the paper even, and I would go so far as to say the smell of it, all are invigorating. So you navigate through your way through this invention that was made around 2,000 years ago with a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction. You can move backwards and forwards in it in a way that you can't if you are dealing with electronic books. They have advantages, of course, but the satisfaction of holding a book in your hands and feeling its texture, letting its physicality express itself is something that I think book lovers really appreciate. And then there's a further consideration. If you look at the printed page, there are all kinds of typographical signs that are connected with the meaning of a book. This can sound rather esoteric, but it was only around the time of Gutenberg that the spread of putting numbers on pages and then breaking text up into chapters and having tables of contents, having all footnotes, all kinds of ways of helping the reader to orient him or herself as the reader went through the text. They existed already in the Middle Ages, but they became standard at the time of the printed book. So when we read a book, we have the satisfaction of being oriented, of working our way through a text, and actually the aesthetic delight of the whole experience. I'll give you one example, if I may. There was a French developer of electronic texts who did some research on what it was that readers liked about books and that electronic texts lacked. And he interviewed a bunch of students in Paris who said, it's the smell. Well, that may sound silly, but a lot of people do like the smell of books, and so he invented a kind of sticker that you put on your computer, you scratch it, and it begins to smell, give off the book smell while you read an electronic text. So all of these things, you put them together, and you find that to plunge into a book is one of the most satisfying experiences possible.
I wonder if you could solve an issue for us right now, which is it ever appropriate to write in a hardcover book?
Well, if you own it, I would scribble all over it. I mean, I cover my books with writing. If it belongs to the library, that's something else. I think you shouldn't do that. But there are lots of techniques of marking your place. I used to tear up little bits of paper and indicate exactly where I thought there were significant passages without marking up the book. But marks in books are one of the most valuable sources of information about how people read. We assume that readers read books the way we do today, but that's a totally false assumption because they lived in a different mental climate. When I was a student at Harvard, first arrived, I heard that you could go into the rare book room, just walk in and ask to see some books. Well, I walked in, I'd heard that they had Herman Melville's copy of Emerson's essays. And sure enough, that appeared before me in a matter of minutes, and I began reading Emerson through Melville's eyes, insofar as that was possible, by reading the marginalia. It was fascinating. You could see this great novelist, reading the works of this great philosopher, and often being utterly disgusted. I mean, there was one passage in which Emerson used a metaphor of the ocean and so on, sounding very grand and happy, and Melville wrote an X next to it, then an X at the bottom of the page, and he said, "To someone who has gone round Cape Horn as a common sailor, what stuff this is." Well, it was thrilling to read that. And so that's the kind of experience that we can capture in our rare book rooms by providing books with marks in them. And furthermore, the Digital Public Library of America will have Melville's copy of Emerson's essays, so that even if you can't go to the rare book room at Harvard, you can see a reproduction of it online.
Wonderful. Robert Darnton, your love of books is so infectious. I'm so glad we had a chance to talk to you here on TVO tonight. Thanks very much for joining us on the line from Boston.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.